and welcome to Relational Leadership. My name is Leonard Cochran.
And I'm Steve Otterstrom.
There you go. We'll work on that.
Well, yeah, we will work on that. We'll get better.
Well, I'm excited today, Steve. I know you've been working on a project, and you're going to share some of your insights from an HR background on the hiring process. So why don't you give us just kind of a quick overview where you think we're going to head with this, and then we'll begin to unpack this and see how it relates to us.
And I love the way you said that, where we think we're going to head with this. I think if there's anything I've learned from doing podcasts with you, Leonard, is sometimes the destination we end at is very different than what I had expected.
That can be true, yes.
And I'm sure with relational leadership, it becomes even more that way. We talked last time about moving through the life cycle of a person's employment. And at the very beginning of that, you have your birth into employment. And maybe even there's a point before the birth where you are trying to figure out where are you going to work? What are you going to do? Looking for that first job or maybe you're perhaps have been in a job and you're looking for that rebirth into employment, that you're trying to find that new job. And I truly believe that when we talk about relational leadership, this is where it starts. This is where the relationship begins.
It's really a good opportunity to set the tone for the relationship anyhow, isn't it? And I know I do have to throw this disclaimer out quick and early. I hate interviewing and I hate going through the process of finding a new job. So if I sound critical along the way, it's with good reason.
Oh, yes. And if you've ever been in that situation, and I'm sure many of our listeners have been, maybe currently are in the situation of looking for a new job, let me just say, I feel you. Yes. I see you. There is there are situations I can think of that are worse, but there's not a lot. I think that time when you are unemployed, when you're looking actively for a job, can be really difficult. In fact, one of the things I find interesting is that I don't usually reply to posts that I see on LinkedIn just because there's too many things on there, and it has to really kind of hit me. And it's not like this was a post that was so out there, unlike anything I'd ever seen before, but it did really resonate with me. This was from someone named Rachel Oates. And it says, it starts out, being unemployed isn't a holiday. And here's the beginning of the post. She says, I was recently asked the question if I was enjoying my time away from working. I know no disrespect was meant by this innocent question, but it's common to assume that the time away from work is leisurely. But for many, it's dedicated towards securing the next opportunity. Despite only a few weeks passing, including the holiday season, I've invested hours in job search activities. So basically, this is an interesting one because it is, I've even heard the term, I'm enjoying my fun employment.
I heard that one.
This idea that, well, the government's giving you money right now and you don't even have to work for it. Isn't everything great? And for the most part, when people are using those terms and they actually are unemployed, they just don't want to tell you, I am literally walking through the valley of the shadow of death at this point. It is a very difficult time to be in. And oftentimes you're in that situation because of having just been let go.
And that's an observation I was going to make, Steve. A lot of people that are unemployed didn't choose to be there. And so when you consider what puts you in that position, you've been through a layoff before, so that's a prime example. We know that psychologically that has an effect on an individual, and your self-confidence wavers, perhaps. Just so many factors play in there. I can't even begin to unpack what all happens, but I know I've been there myself. And bottom line is you just feel like a giant blob sitting on the couch. And like you've alluded to with that LinkedIn post, it takes work to find work. And you have to do that while your confidence is down. And so I think that's why a factor, let me just say it that way, that's it. That's why it's just one factor of why looking for work, for me personally, is such a miserable process, because you're a little bit shaken to the core to begin with. Even if you build up and suck it up and build that gumption up and build some self-confidence, then you still have that rejection of not making it to the prom. You didn't get the job, or you didn't qualify, and each one of them things becomes a little bit of a ding in your personal esteem, perhaps.
Well, I think even more challenging, and this goes to our theme of relationships, relational leadership, even more challenging is that you had a host of relationships, and all of a sudden, from one minute to the next, somebody looking at a spreadsheet said, I'm just going to flip the switch on all of those and they'll disappear. Now, I know people could be like, well, Stephen, but you can maintain those relationships. You can, and in a few certain circumstances you will. I mean, Leonard and I, we don't work together anymore. We've maintained that relationship over 4 years now. So I think we are the success story.
Yeah,
and
it is a rarity. Let's be honest, right? It is a rarity.
It's a rarity.
Especially if you're the one shown the door. The last thing I want to do is stick my head in there and say, "Hey guys, how you doing? I'm out here unemployed, looking for work, and are you guys okay?"
Yes, and for the people who stayed on the ship, essentially, there is the aspect that it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. It's, what do I say? How do I interact with them? They're going to be downers,
right?
And there's survivor's guilt that they're experiencing on the other side. You know, in this LinkedIn post, there was some additional messages there, and some talking about things like essentially the challenge of, losing your friends. And there was one very unhelpful post that said, you need to know that your coworkers are not your friends. They're your coworkers. What? I don't even know where to go with that. Because even if it's true, I'm not sure how that helps to say, oh, you fell for it. It's kind of like, well, you just need to know that woman you loved for all your life, you thought was your wife, she actually was married to someone else. So just feel better about it, okay? No, if that is the case, you feel deceived, you feel lied to. And that is also part of what you feel when you have felt like you have been loyal to an organization, and now that loyalty was not extended back. It's the great myth that your company cares about you, and your company does not. But it doesn't mean that it didn't feel real.
Well, they care until the bottom line dictates otherwise, maybe.
Yes. Well,
we'll give them a little credit.
Yeah, give them a little credit, and maybe even a lot of credit. I mean, there are circumstances where I bet there are individuals who are going through the process of laying off, and they're doing it for the benefit of those that are going to remain, making sure that the company stays afloat.
Right.
That it's got to be a difficult decision to decide which people to throw overboard so that the ship doesn't sink.
Yeah, especially when you consider a smaller organization, right? So I know so much of kind of what you're leaning into initially and talking about is larger organizations with that spreadsheet and just ticking boxes and emptying people out the door.
And protecting the bonus at the end.
Yeah.
You have to have a certain profit margin, and this gets me to where it needs to be. It's the whole, whatever needs to be done is done in order to protect the shareholders.
Yeah.
And that is as far as it goes.
Yeah. And then when we deal with smaller businesses, 50 employees or less, even for that matter. I know technically SBA Small Business Administration probably considers small bigger than I do. But anyways, when you get to the real small ones, then that is so painstaking and so difficult and maybe even uglier when you have to let somebody go. So
yeah. And the whole point is really, because this could be another conversation on the opposite side of the relational leadership life cycle of employment. And I do think how we let people go could be its own separate podcast.
Absolutely.
With a relational leadership mindset.
Yes.
And, when we do that one, I'm going to get a glass of wine here and I'm going to sit down, prepare myself for trauma. Now, I'm not going to drink the wine, but I'm going to have it here just to look at it because it's going to be very pretty and make me feel better in some way or another. And I think, Leonard, you'll probably, we can keep the wine in the video feed so that you can look at it too, because I've been out with you a few times, and I think you're about as heavy a drinker as I am.
Right. Mountain Dew is my favorite, so we don't go too far past that. Well, let's go ahead then, Steve, and kind of jump in then to that hiring process. So we talked about the emotion of what it's like to be unemployed, and we could spend too long talking about
We
that.
could
I'm
spend
sure.
too long.
So tell me a little bit about your area of expertise there, and kind of guide us on that road, if you would.
Well, let's take a look at it from this perspective of thinking about it as you are hiring somebody.
Yes. All right.
And you're in that situation, and you're going to be, one of the things you're doing is you're throwing your net. You're throwing your net wide. You're throwing it to try and capture the biggest fish out there that's going to make a difference for you. And I think one of the things that we think about is we have such a mindset of, this is the fish I want to catch. Sometimes we don't think that the relationship goes much wider than that. Looking at it from this perspective of relational leadership, and relational leadership is more than just being nice and liking the people you're working with. I believe relational leadership really has to do with recognizing that human connection is an underlying foundation of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
It actually supersedes the business relationship. It actually is, it is a foundational core principle that you apply in different places. It's kind of like your value of, I don't steal. Or maybe your value is that you do steal. We're not saying what anybody's value should or shouldn't be. But if you look at something like honesty or integrity, it's not a matter of, I'm very honest when I don't have an opportunity to steal something. But when that opportunity to steal something is there, well then, the whole idea behind having a value is that it causes you to act in a way that perhaps isn't even in what appears to be your immediate best interest. It creates the ability to do something like to sacrifice.
Yeah. And that, you're absolutely right, Steve. And in my book, I call those values, I call that our principles. So those are the principles we live by. And so, to your point, in the business world or wherever we are, our principles should be such that we can live by them all the time, not just when it's to our advantage, not just when we're in the workplace, but we should establish principles that are something core enough of our belief that we operate in those all the time. And they're just emphasized from a business perspective, just as that casual reminder that, oh yeah, I need to remember this is the way we operate as a company. Because you and I share so many life principles that are so similar. But you may well have some deviance one way and I another way. But if we're working for the same employer, then we have to put on that hat from the employer perspective, and this is what they mean by this integrity or by this principle that we're sharing, that type of thing. So just throwing that out for food for thought.
Yeah. Well, so here's the challenge I think we run into. So is relational leadership, it's obvious from the perspective of the candidate I hire. And I don't think anybody would argue that it's important that from the very first interaction that they have with your organization, even if it's a recruiter that is bringing people in, that is acting on behalf of your organization, that has a lot to do with the foundation of that relationship. Yeah. Now, that's the easy one. Everybody gets that. But what about the relationship with the people who aren't hired? And this is a wide spectrum. This is a very wide spectrum, because you've got the person who went through the interview process. It was narrowed down to the final two. And they only were going to take one. They went through all 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 interviews. Some companies get pretty extreme on the number of interviews. You have that one where really a relationship was formed, and now they're going to have a little bit of a rejection when you let them know. You only get to tell one person they get the job, and you get to tell all the others they didn't. So you have those that were a lot more involved in the hiring process, all the way down to perhaps the hundreds, sometimes even thousands of individuals who entered applications.
Yeah.
What is our relationship obligation to those individuals? I'd love to hear, what is our relationship liability with those individuals as well.
Well, go ahead and unpack what you mean by liability there, and then I'll jump back into where I was going to go.
So, when we think about a relationship, there is an opportunity and there's a liability, I think, that exists in any relationship that we have. I have an opportunity to meet you, Leonard, and have a great friendship, or I have an opportunity to cut you off on the freeway, show you my favorite finger, and potentially create a hostile environment between the two of us that in some circumstances we've seen to escalate to catastrophic situations. Anytime I encounter someone, I have an opportunity to either build a relationship or potentially to even build a liability. So there's my thought. Now, in maybe a business type environment, I might be looking at it from the perspective of reputational harm could happen in my liability area. There could be even the potential of this person could be a prospective client at some point in the future. So there really is no bridge that's worth burning most of the time.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because I know what I was thinking as you were talking about the application process, and we're talking about principles and how we handle things. If I'm a principled person that opens the door for people as a courtesy, and it's my family walking through the door or my wife walking through the door, certainly I'm going to hold the door open for her. But if I see, it's not my wife, and just let the door slam, then I'm not being true to that principle, although it didn't, quote unquote, didn't matter because it's not my wife. And so what you're talking about, the application process, somewhat similar to that. I didn't hire you, so therefore I can let that door slam in your face. Right?
Yes.
And so from a relational leadership perspective, there might be a better way of handling that. That's what I'm hearing.
And I think you've said it really well in looking at it from the perspective. There's a difference between even I see somebody who is 20 feet back and letting the door close, and someone who's right there and I just slam it in front of them. There is a big difference in that. I think some things that just go to good hiring hygiene from the perspective of maintaining your relationships. One would be if you have people set up accounts to apply for jobs and you have a place for them to track their progress. If you don't update it, you're doing relational harm. And you may think, well, what does it really matter? This person doesn't mean anything to me. The reality, though, is your company's name is on it and your company's brand is on that. And if you're not updating it, you are literally exposing your organizations to hundreds, sometimes thousands of individuals who are getting an impression about your company and your ability to manage things effectively. And it's almost like this death of 1,000 paper cuts. So many people apply and it never goes anywhere. I haven't applied for jobs for a while. I'm so glad to not be doing that. And I hope not to have to apply for a job ever again.
Right.
Because it is really one of the most horrible experiences you go through is that hiring process. But when I was in it, there were certain companies that would come up in the feed saying, this might be an interest. I'm like, no, they don't actually do anything. Even that you create the impression, oftentimes there's this impression that's created. I believe this to be true. I know in some circumstances it is, but many companies hire, or not companies, it's more managers. The company has a policy that says you've got to look outside for a potential candidate. Right. That we don't want to have, for lack of a better term, this is a horrible way of saying it, incestual hiring, where we are only taking from within, especially as there becomes a greater acknowledgement that bringing diversity into the workplace, bringing different thoughts, different perspectives, different backgrounds, actually enriches the ability for your organization to grow. Especially as that starts to happen, there's a push to say, well, we shouldn't just hire. I mean, hiring from within is good, but we should also be looking externally. And so because of that, you have a lot of circumstances where managers, leaders have in mind exactly who they want, but they now have a hurdle they need to jump over, and that is the hurdle of the corporate's corporate's policy of opening those positions up to outside hires as well. And it's kind of like, I remember seeing this when I worked in hospitality, the competitive bid process. You had to get 3 bids. Now, you had a contractor you always worked with. You had a relationship with that contractor. But in order to award that, you needed to go out and find 2 other bids. So you find another company, you ask them for their 2 bids, you say, thank you so much. You go with the one you were already planning. And in some of these circumstances, there is a lot of time and effort that is that those other organizations put into to build those bids for you. And essentially, you've just stolen their time. It's kind of a relational theft that you have done because you haven't been honest. They never were a real contender. You never were going to look at their bid seriously. All you needed to do was get 2 bids and then come up with your own justification as to why you selected the one that you always choose. And I see that happen in the hiring process as well. In fact, probably one of the most recent interviews I had, and I appreciate that the person I spoke to was honest about it. It was a circumstance where I had been told that there was a position that was open, and I went to apply for it, and that position had been closed. Now, the position had only been open a couple of days. This is how you know for sure. If it's only been open the minimum amount of time, it was performative. It was performative. And so I replied back to the person who had told me, oh, I'm sorry, it looks like I was too slow. And they're like, well, that's interesting. and so because I had an in, the hiring manager called me and said, I have an inside person. I have a person I'm already planning to put into this position, which I appreciate because you know what? I don't want to put all that time and effort. I don't want to go through 4 different levels of hiring. When in the
resume, doing all that fun stuff.
Resume, I'm not going to be considered. And even from the perspective, in another area of dishonesty is when we post a range of pay that we have no intention of honoring. You know, that was another thing with this particular position, and I'm just using this example. This happens all the time. Is it would have worked because of the upper end of that range of pay, but they said, "Yeah, we're not going to be paying that much. We're going to be paying the lower end."
It falls within range, but that's not what we want to fill.
But that's not, exactly. And especially because they say, we look around and we see that you would be being paid more than other people that are already in this position. Well, to be honest, I have decades more experience than other people that are already in that position. So if you hire me, you're going to have to pay me what I'm worth. And so there's multiple levels of dishonesty that can come in, and dishonesty is really a relational killer.
Yeah. And I was thinking, Steve, as we're talking about these things, surely to goodness we've all experienced them. I know how.
Yes.
So if I have and you have, everybody has. Well, maybe. But anyways, but the thing that I notice about it as you're talking, individually, each of these little things sounds so small, and it doesn't sound like a big deal. But the irony is, as you were speaking, I know, and I don't live where you live, so I know locally when I see particular companies posting jobs, that's not the place to go apply, because I know I've heard too many stories of whether it's the pay grade, like you're talking about, that they'll advertise that range and they always hire the low end with the hopes of eventually advancing. And then folks stay there a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they never get that advancement. So there's companies like that, or there's companies that the bids, as you were calling it, they always put out these jobs where they're fishing to see what's in the market, to know what pay range might be palatable or whatever they're fishing for, and they have very little intent of actually hiring. So that's where, as we see these repeat, or multiple of these things working together, that's where that relational issue comes into play that you're addressing right now. You're totally right, because we then establish a reputation that we don't want to have as an individual or as a company, for that matter.
Yeah. And I think another area where, in essence, saying bad hygiene, but what I really mean is lower integrity, sometimes to a large degree, sometimes to a smaller degree, but lower integrity. In that integrity, no one wants to have a relationship with someone who is not honest. And so you're creating a relationship liability when that integrity comes down. But we have mentioned not keeping up. If you are saying they can track their position, they ought to be able to track the position. It should not be open 6 months later saying, still filling.
Yeah.
Even if you decided not to hire that position, that needs to be closed out if you're going to be doing something like that, or it's a stain on your organization and it's a challenge for the relationships that you may need to hire that person later on. They may not have been your first choice this time, but they may be your first choice next time. The other thing that needs to be done is there has to be, if you are putting a position out there, it has to legitimately be that you would hire someone externally. An end to performative job openings would have to fit into that space. And then, there are many other things that come into play as well when you are trying to hire people. One would be, don't ask for so much up front. I have since really changed the way I looked at things, but while I'm done applying for jobs, I do apply for jobs from the perspective that I'm an independent consultant. And so I put in bids, which in many ways is an application for jobs. And those are very important to maintain those relationships. I don't need to win the bid. I do need to win the relationship. I think I've mentioned this before. I don't think I have a single client that I didn't work on for more than a year before they became someone that actually signed a check. Well, nobody signs checks anymore. Made a deposit into my account. It takes that time. But there are times that, especially because I'm in the training world, there will be training companies that say, oh, we're looking for trainers. And they want me to do all the work. And I used to do this. I used to, some of them would be like, send in a video. Like they want an application, they want this. And it's one thing to say, send in a video, because I can create a video and you can get my same video that everybody else is going to get. But when they say send in a video and they have specific requirements that are in those videos, it's almost like they want to say, we're going to make you work for it. We're not going to pay you for it, but we are going to make you work for it. And I remember doing one for an organization, and I sent in the video, and then within a day, I got the response back saying, thank you for applying. But it was so quick, I doubt they could have even seen that video. And even if they had, if you're going to ask people to do an extraordinary amount of work, they deserve a conversation with you. You need to talk to them. So now when I look at postings that require a large amount of work, or when they want me to do a psychometric evaluation, I will just go beyond those. They're not even worth the time, because I've got other places I need to be, other organizations who are a little bit more serious about my time. So don't ask so much.
Well, and really that comes through relationship that you even know that, Steve, when you think about it, right? Mm-hmm. So because of your position of being able to do contract work, you've got some folks that are repeat customers, obviously.
Yes.
And so those are the ones that you then lean into to get the work, rather than jump through the hoops of somebody that you've never met, is what it comes down to. And so it's that relationship. Yeah. So it is that relationship. But you're so right in that, because I think, unfortunately, the idea of too much work, and I do understand some of that, but putting too much work on the person looking for the job basically screams, how hungry are you, and what can I get away with when I hire you? And It might not be their true motive, but that seems to be what the undercurrent is at that point in time. I can remember early in my career, did not always make the best moves and the best decisions because I was still young, and I might slip up and do something goofy like this in the future. Who knows? But I do remember being offered a job, went through the interview process, offered the job, and they told me the amount. And I said, well, that's really not enough. And he said, well, that's what it pays. And it was a little bit frustrating to just have that literal response like that. And then when I took the job, which I did, I took it knowing what the pay was. There wasn't movement afterwards. And so here's somebody that hired me knowing that I actually wanted more than what it paid. And then they never afforded me an opportunity to get an increase either. And so you could blame me in that situation because I was told up front they weren't going to pay more, but yet that person knew what my desire was as well. So it sort of interplays and both parties being responsible as I look back.
It does. It really does. Now, I think what's interesting about this is, like, of course, we've really tried to talk about the places that we don't usually think about with relationships, and that is those that you don't hire. But I think it might make sense for us now to shift gears a little bit and talk about it from the perspective of how do you now begin the most important relationship with the person you do decide to bring into the organization.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, this is interesting because I think before we get to that, let's talk about relational leadership in the hiring process. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time in the interview space, because if I'm hired into an organization and I have my first interview, it is very much like my first date. Yes. And it could be that I want it to be kind of like The Bachelor, where I have 21 eligible individuals and I am slowly removing them, giving a rose to one and giving a rose to the other and causing them infighting and all of those things. But what I do wonder when I watch something like The Bachelor, and I'm ashamed to admit that there's been a time or two I kind of got into it. I thought, oh man, this is such horrible television. Why am I watching it? But when you look at that, you think this is about the most unhealthy way a relationship could start, as a competition, fighting for the love of the one. With that being said, when you are in that process, this is similar to the dating process. And if I really want to get the best, and if you've ever watched The Bachelor, you realize the best never makes it to the end. The one you would actually want to spend your life with, the cool one who has their own thoughts, that isn't generated specifically to try and be as much like the individual's, crazy desires. That person has been gone for weeks and weeks. The one that actually wanted to have a friendship, which, I've been married for 25 years. You've been married longer. Friendship goes further than romance. I'll tell you, if you want to be in a long relationship, marry your friend. And, doesn't mean romance is dead, but it just means romance is always going to be, for the weekends or for whenever. It's the friendship is what really works. Yeah. And if you want to get that long-term individual, a relationship has to be built that isn't just about, I will take you through a series of tests, and if you are proven worthy, you will have a spot at our table. So how do we do that? How do we create these relationships in our interviewing processes? What are your thoughts, Leonard? What are some things that we can do?
Well, certainly, since we're talking about relationships and courting, just as in courting, we put our best foot forward, right? And so in hiring someone, we want to represent our company and represent it well. And so there's simple things that we can do to sort of soften it, making it easier for the person that's applying. Now, I don't mean make it easy for them to get the job per se, but giving them the information they need and being truthful about it up front. Here's how our company works. Sharing what your principles are, sharing what your purpose is, walking them through those things that are important for them to know, to understand from their opinion, do they even feel they align with the larger portion of the company? Because we do hire for positions, but those positions work under that larger umbrella of who the company is, what the organization is. And so let them self-determine as well if they see are they a fit or not.
It's always a nice thing, and kind of going back to the whole Bachelor analogy. If you are one of the eligible individuals, and you realize, you know what, even if I won that rose, that is not where I would want to be. It's okay to take yourself out, and you can do that if there's been honesty up front. I think another thing is making sure you're clear about what your objectives are, why you're asking questions, what is it that you're looking for, so that you give them an opportunity to show what they have if they have it. One of the things that we often talk about when doing training on how to conduct interviews, we say, who do you want to hire? And they'll say, well, the person with the most experience. And oftentimes it comes down to this word qualified. Whoever's the most qualified. And that's an interesting word, and I'm not actually sure that's where we want to be. I mean, it's great to say I would hire always the most qualified person, but the most qualified person may not, and I want to be careful about saying this because I want to say a good fit, because sometimes we say good fit and it just means, oh, that's my way of applying bias to the situation. But it may not actually meet your objective in hiring. Generally speaking, what you want to look for is who has the greatest potential to create gain for your company. You may have an individual who doesn't have as much experience as other people, but they show an intense amount of potential. And there's a lot of research out there, a lot of people who have looked at I think we can go clear back to I'll have to look him up really quick. It was in the 1970s. I think David McClelland, he was one of the first to really talking about testing to look for more than just classic intelligence. He says, what you know doesn't really make that big a difference. It's actually aspects such as resiliency, such as even Goleman's emotional intelligence, or if we just want to do a series of tests and those types of things, well, you probably are going to get someone who's good at doing tests, and if that's the job, then great, you've hired just the right person.
Yeah.
Another challenge we sometimes have when we're doing this relational leadership, we want diversity. We want to bring in other ways of thinking, and yet we sometimes use a way of conducting interviews that is too standardized. Now, there's good research out there that shows standardized interviewing does work better than just ad hoc, I thought of a question.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not trying to put myself contrary to that research that I think is pretty well founded. But what I am saying is things like STAR interviewing, very good in concept. The behavioral based interview is situation or task, what action you took, what were the results that happened from that action that you took. The challenge with something like STAR interviewing is that you're forcing all the answers to be given in a certain format. And oftentimes what ends up happening is people get judged on their ability to answer in a specific format rather than actually determining what their potential will be.
It's so much like standardized testing in school. You've got certain individuals that can perform well under the parameters of what a standard test requires and how much time is allowed and so on. And then you have other kids that can perform exceptionally well, but cave under the pressure of that test, or maybe they miss something where they just are not adept to doing tests, but they have the head knowledge outside of that testing environment. And so I can certainly see the risks in putting too much value in just that test and just that information or format like what you're talking about.
Well, and even from the perspective that as a interviewer, it should be your skill set that allows you to modify the way you ask a question to get the information you need. You're on a hunting expedition. It means you're searching it out. You're not on a sitting and waiting to see what comes by, but you're actually searching out to find out what potential they may have. In fact, even before you go into the interview process, you should be asking yourself, what would be the best way for me to determine the level of potential this individual has? And oftentimes it may be, are there things that they have done in their past behavior as a indicator of what future behavior will be. However, there are many different ways that this may show up. And it may be a matter of I do want to know what the situation or task that you had. I do want to know what action you took. I do want to know what the result was. Do I have to ask that as one question and then have you put it into a nice package for me and give it back? No, I don't. I can say, have you ever had a time that was like that? Well, that's really interesting. Can you tell me what you did? I could actually ask 4 questions to get me a full star. And
Yes.
Instead of me trying to say, you have to bend to me, I can bend to you. Because my objective is not, are you good at answering a particular format? My objective is to find out your potential. So often when we do these standardized types of interview guides and things like that, The other challenge that we have is that we have an initial question, but I have found that it is never the initial question that produces the pay dirt.
Mm.
And it doesn't, it's not a critique on the question. It could be the best question that ever existed. It's kind of like if you went into a police interrogation. If the police had one question to ask, I don't think they would ever get a confession.
Yeah, and if they wrote all of their questions on a sheet of paper prior to the interrogation and stayed to the script of that piece of paper, they'd never get to the confession either, would they?
Yeah, no,
So
I'm sure that in a good interrogation, they do come in with some questions in mind.
Oh, absolutely.
They've already thought through where they're at, but where they place them and how they put them, or it's kind of goes to Eisenhower's D-Day example where he said, we will plan and plan and plan, but once boots are on the ground, the plan goes out the window. That plan is still valid. It's still important, and you should do it. It's just you have to realize that you will have to move away from that plan. So having an interview guide, having some structure, having those things, not only is it a good idea, but it is something that has been proven to be more effective than not having those things. However, also sticking to those, as this is the only way that we can ask or answer these questions, is also not a good idea. And I think one of the reasons I remember when I was working at Marriott, this became a big thing. We start interviewing, interview guides, and you had a specific guide for all the different job families or job groups. So sometimes it could be like a front desk person and a host at the restaurant. They ended up having this exact same interview guide because they're in the same job family. It did have the advantage that if somebody was going to apply for a job, I could actually, as the HR guy, or they could have as well, they just didn't know where to find it. I could go in and I could find the interview guide and I could give it to them so that they could go home and practice and think about how they were going to answer these questions, which is another item. Unless the skill that you're trying to determine is how well do they speak on their feet, it doesn't hurt to let them know what questions you're going to be asking them, or what topics you're going to cover, so that when they come in, they already have in mind. Because it's not a matter of like you're passing these mythical tests. You're trying to determine their potential. And if they're more of a reflective individual and they need time to ponder and think about it, you'll get better answers. You'll hit that pay dirt so much quicker if you have that perspective of, I'm actually going to respect them enough and I'm going to make them feel comfortable enough. We start to move in that realm of psychological safety. Mm-hmm. They start to feel like, you know what? I feel comfortable with Leonard. I feel comfortable with this interaction that I'm having, all because I acknowledged that they may need it a little bit different and I provided opportunities for them.
And you bring up such a great point with that. I'm not necessarily a highly reflective interview person. Or let me rephrase that. I'm not such a highly reflective person. I'm pretty free to speak what's on my mind. But once you put me on that hot seat of an interview, that's where I struggle with details and specifics. And to your point, what harm would it be to give me those questions ahead of time and let me prepare? I'm not going to pull up something and lie to you. Yeah, I'm still going to be truthful with you, but then I will have a chance to actually find something that answers the question you're looking for, as opposed to having that panic moment of generalized thoughts of which one is close to what they're saying so I can at least have an answer rather than no answer. And so really, again, that plays in with that relationship concept. So getting to know the person in the interview or preparing in advance for a broad swath of personalities in an interview and accommodating for that. But if during the interview itself you find something being ineffective, to your point, what's the harm in asking a follow-up question? I know I remember a job that I was turned down for, and I was turned down because I used the word we too often. And so they were concerned I didn't have the personal experience they were looking for. But never during the entire interview did they ever say, please clarify we. And what I meant by we is our policy was this is how we as a company did it. Therefore, I did it the way the company wanted it, but I was the one doing the work. Well, shame on me for not saying I the whole time. But conversely to that, how many times have we heard that braggadocious interview person that I did this, I did this, I did this, and you think, my gosh, they're not a team player. So a simple clarifying question could help pivot the entire direction of a interview.
And I think it's fair, and it's not often that I've seen this, but that when you have an interview and in that interview, somebody or the interviewer tells you, these are my concerns. These are my concerns. And it goes to what you said. When I have felt more disrespected is when after the fact they have told me this is why you weren't hired. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I'm actually really good in that space, but you never told me that was a concern of yours. I actually excel in that space, but you never told me. You expected me to just intuitively know that that was your concern. And it is also really powerful from the perspective that only one person is getting good news. The rest are getting bad news. And everyone who comes in and interviews with you, the reason they're there is because they're interested. I mean, there's an exception there. I don't want to speak in absolutes, but almost everybody, they're excited about it. They're talking to their family and their friends about it. They're saying, I'm hoping I'm going to get this job doing this thing. And you're giving one person good news. The rest are going to go back to their family and friends, and they're going to tell them about the asshole who didn't hire them.
It's the old, well, it's not the telephone game, but, the person that gets good news tells one or two people, and the person with bad news tells 6 or 8 people, right?
Yes. And one of the challenges is it's kind of like getting dumped over a text or even worse, a sticky note or something that you can't really respond to. It's just like, guess what? We're over. Move on. I'm happy. And they're still like, wait a minute. I was yesterday writing a moment of hope, this possibility I was going somewhere. One of the things that can actually help blunt that is the same thing that we always say during annual reviews. We say nobody should be too surprised by that. Nobody should be too surprised that if in that annual review you say, I'm sorry, you really stink. I can't take you. No one should be too surprised. It's okay to have a little bit of a dialogue with the people who are in the process. And if it's not you, it could be a recruiter who's maintaining that relationship back and forth saying, hey, this is where we're at. Let me just tell you what some of the thoughts are that they have. It can be as simple as, Leonard, I am really impressed with what you have done so far. And I could see potentially you could be a really good fit for this organization. Let me tell you, one of my concerns, though, is that I see that you've only had about 2 years of experience in this space. And we're currently interviewing some people who have a lot more experience. What are your thoughts?
Right.
So now you have an opportunity to speak to it. You feel heard. You also know that this is a concern.
Yes.
And so if you are eventually told you're not getting the job, then you're going to walk away from this going, oh, okay, well, it was the experience thing. And the reason why this is especially important when you're in this level of the interview is because I may hire somebody who stays for a month. And Leonard was a really good candidate. And so I need to be in a position that I still have a relationship with Leonard that I can reach out and say, hey, Leonard, hey, we hired that person that had 10 years of experience and we should have hired you.
Yeah.
Are you interested in giving us a try? Like, you may need to go back to Leonard as a very strong second choice. And I know I've had times where we've been hiring people and it was on a razor's edge. I think if someone had sneezed, we would have hired the other person. It's sometimes that can be so difficult to decide who you're going to hire, and you don't know if you're getting the right person. You don't know if you're getting the person with the most potential or the most qualifications. We all think that we're really good at reading people, but we're not nearly as good as we think we are. And you need to maintain that relationship because you may need them later on. Or Leonard may get 5 more years of experience and then come back. And he'll do that because you had that conversation. But when you hide from them what the concerns are that you have, you do yourself a disservice because you may not get the right person. You never had an opportunity to find out how they could compensate for those. And you do them a disservice because they end the relationship with you.
Yeah, and this so closely aligns to one of my favorite quotes is any unsaid expectation is an unfair expectation.
Yes.
And so if we're looking for someone with particular qualities or qualifications that miss it, then what is the harm during the interviewing process or before that door is slammed in clarifying your position of, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And to your point, even saying, hey, what do you think about this? Or how do you respond to this? Or do you have that qualification and I'm not, just hadn't seen it so far? Those are the types of things. And to your point, it absolutely does happen. It's not a hypothetical that you might need to go to candidate B in the near short-term future. My wife tells a story, a true account of when she was looking for a position and didn't get it. And she cried about it. It was the first time trying to get in an office deal. She was a young teenager at the time. And lo and behold, a week or two later, they called her up because that person that took the job didn't keep it, didn't want it, whatever the circumstance were. And they hired my wife. And my wife worked there successfully for years after she was hired. And so she missed it by whatever reason, sliver of a chance. Maybe it was a big chance, but they came back to her and she ended up being a valuable employee for that company. So those are the things we can't know and we can't see up front. But those are the things that can tarnish our reputation if we just plow through the process and not remember that process involves people and the way we handle those people. And believe me, I'm not a perfect person in this. It's real easy to get caught up in the process and kind of forget the fact there's a human being at the other end of this process, and that's what I need to be concerned with. And it takes work. It's effort.
And I know we've spent a lot more time talking about the ones you don't hire than the ones you do. And I think in many ways it's because the one you do hire is spoken about so much more. And it does make sense that with that person that you do hire, they're the ones that are excited. They're the ones that are. I know when I got my job at Hilton, I was going through the whole process. It was a long process. I did tons of interviews, and you know what? In the end, they offered me the job. So when they sent me that little survey saying, how did you feel about the hiring process? I was like, loved it.
Right. You hired me, so it works.
You hired me. It was the best process ever.
That's right.
But the reality is that's really not the person you should be asking. That is a very skewed at the moment of greatest elation. If people say I hated the hiring process, and also I would have never even said that, even if I had hated the hiring process, because I'm brand new to the organization. I'm not making waves even before they finish signing my new hire work.
Right.
Definitely, I'm going to say that I love it. And I think that's one of the challenges we have is we look at the survivors and we say, what was your experience with this? Ask every person who has the gold medal, was this a fair challenge? Oh, yes, of course. I know because I won. In fact, there's even some interesting social studies that they've done where they've had people play a game of Monopoly and they cheat. They give one person extra money or an extra advantage. And then when that person wins, they say, well, do you feel like you would have won anyways? And they say, yes, absolutely, I would have, because it was my strategy, it was my this, it was my that. It didn't have anything to do that I started out with more money than anybody else, or I started out with, I'm the winner. So of course that was a fair and good game. So they're kind of at their high and they're coming in at their high. And this is a good opportunity for you. And we haven't talked about this much when you do hire that person to ride that wave as long as you can, to make sure that this is the opportunity to begin building relationships. And one of the things when we look at relational leadership, it's not just, in fact, I would say it's not even primarily the relationship between leader and subordinate. It's the relationships, the web of relationships that exist within a department or within an organization. So now you are looking at it from the perspective of how do I take this energy that this new employee has, and how do I help that be nurtured and grow and perhaps feed the web of other relationships. And I think that's probably a really good conversation for us to have next time.
Yeah, because if done well, that energy of that new person coming on the team can help to bring energy to that whole web of relationships. But if done incorrectly, that new person can just curl up and and not be very productive, for lack of better words of saying it. Right?
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, Steve, this has been great. For those of you in the process of looking for work, thinking about work, or in the hiring process, take some time to think about some of the things that we've said. Maybe you've got some ideas of your own that we missed. Obviously, there's plenty of things out there we could have added to it. So we would love to hear from you. So in the information about the show, we've got a place where you can contact us and reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And we will be back next time with more details and more fun that falls under that large umbrella of relational leadership. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.